You drift into the night with the soft whir of your fan in the background, and something in the air feels older than sleep itself. Imagine yourself holding a tiny ember cupped between your palms, warmth glowing against the darkness. Humanity's story, after all, doesn't begin with grand machines or glowing screens. It begins with a spark, a crackle, a hiss of fire splitting the cold night. And you, right now, are leaning close to it, watching the flames lick upward as if they were alive. So, before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you enjoy what I'm doing here. And while you're at it, I'd love to know where you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now turn off the lights, turn on the fan for a soft background hum, and let's go on a nighttime journey together. Fire was not discovered once, but again and again. Early humans scavenged natural flames, lightning strikes, volcanic eruptions, and slowly learned how to tame them. The first true invention wasn't fire itself, but the control of fire. Fun fact: evidence suggests humans mastered fire at least 1 million years ago, though some argue it may go back 2 million. That means every spark in your kitchen stove is echoing something unimaginably ancient. The glow of flames wasn't just about warmth, it was security from predators, the chance to cook food, and the possibility to gather in groups long after sunset. One odd little fact: some archaeologists believe fire shaped our brains because cooked food made nutrients more accessible, fueling cognitive growth. Without fire, you might not even be able to imagine this story. But fire alone doesn't move you. You need something to carry you forward. And that brings us to another invention older than writing: the wheel. Strangely enough, the wheel didn't show up immediately. Humanity had fire, stone blades, even weaving, before anyone thought to carve a disc and roll it. The earliest known wheel comes from Mesopotamia, around 350 BC. At first, wheels weren't for transport at all. They were used in pottery. Imagine that. Our first wheels spun clay, not carts. Historians still argue why the wheel took so long to appear. After all, round objects exist everywhere in nature. Some say the delay came because smooth, durable roads didn't exist yet. A wheel without a road is like a smartphone without Wi-Fi. Impressive, but limited. And speaking of stone, sharpened edges were among the first technologies that truly changed survival. The hand axe, with its teardrop shape, was the Swiss Army knife of prehistory. It sliced meat, chopped wood, and even cracked open bones for marrow. Fun fact: some of these axes were so carefully shaped that archaeologists suspect they were also early status symbols, not just tools. Imagine showing off your hand axe at a prehistoric party. Alongside axes came needles. Yes, sewing needles carved from bone. This may not sound glamorous, but sewing was a revolutionary invention. Clothing stitched from hides allowed humans to survive in colder climates, expanding migration. Odd fact: some of the earliest needles had tiny carved eyes for thread, proof that even Ice Age seamstresses had an eye for detail. Without those stitches, humanity might have been trapped in the warm equatorial belt forever. Now picture yourself leaning back, listening to the crackle of a campfire, the clatter of stone tools, and the hush of wind across an empty steppe. Inventions weren't just physical objects, they were survival strategies. Take ropes, for example. Twisted fibers of plants became cords, and cords became rope, enabling traps, fishing nets, and shelters. Archaeologists have even found 30,000-year-old twisted fiber imprints on clay, proof that people were tying knots long before history was written down. Another fascinating invention is the flute. Yes, music sneaks into this story too. The oldest known flutes, made of bird bones, date back more than 40,000 years. Picture that while mammoths still roamed the earth, humans sat around fires playing songs. That's not just an invention, it's a declaration that survival is not enough. Humanity has always craved meaning, rhythm, and beauty. Of course, not every invention is glamorous. Containers, baskets, gourds, later clay pots, transformed daily life. They turned food gathering from a race against time into a system of storage. A woven basket may not sparkle like firelight, but it was as essential as any smartphone app you use today. Oddly enough, historians debate whether the bow and arrow counts as one invention. The bow is useless without the arrow, and the arrow pointless without the bow. The earliest evidence dates back about 64,000 years, found in South Africa. The bow gave humans distance, precision, and power far beyond the swing of a club. It also made hunting safer, or depending on your point of view, made humans far deadlier than they'd ever been. One last quirky fact before you drift deeper. Chewing gum is also prehistoric. People in Northern Europe chewed birch tar thousands of years ago, not for flavor, but probably for its antiseptic properties and maybe even to fix broken tools. So yes, your stick of mint gum has a Stone Age ancestor. When you look at this cluster of early sparks, fire, wheels, axes, ropes, music, clothing, containers, you realize that invention isn't always about genius moment. It's often about countless hands shaping little improvements, mistakes turning into breakthroughs, and necessities nudging creativity forward. And here you are lying in the dark, carried along by this ancient thread of invention. The hum of your fan is just another echo of firelight, another reminder that every modern comfort rests on a foundation carved long before your name was ever spoken. You drift deeper now, leaving behind the flicker of firelight and the first crude wheels. The air feels sharper, colder, as though you've stepped into a cavern echoing with the ring of stone on stone. Here, the world is filled with the sound of invention, not yet made of steel or electricity, but of bone and flint, chipped and carved by patient hands. Imagine crouching beside one of your ancestors. She isn't famous, no name carved into history, but her fingertips are calloused from shaping tools you'd barely glance at today. A shard of flint is turned against a heavier rock, sharp flakes scattering like sparks. Each chip creates an edge, sharper than broken glass, sharper even than many modern knives. These weren't disposable bits of rubble, they were lifelines. Fun fact, flint blades were so efficient that modern surgeons have tested them for cutting flesh, and they can actually be sharper and cause less tissue damage than steel scalpels. Yes, your ancestor was essentially working with prehistoric surgical-grade technology. Bone entered the picture too, hollow and light yet surprisingly strong. Early hunters realized that bone could be sharpened into needles, hooks, or awls. Imagine threading sinew through a tiny bone needle, sewing together hides to form a coat. That invention alone shifted humanity's survival odds. Without sewn clothing, migrations into colder climates would have been impossible. Archaeologists argue that needles, some dating back over 50,000 years, may have been as vital as fire in expanding humanity's reach. Odd fact, some of the earliest bone tools weren't for survival at all, but for decoration. Beads carved from ivory and shell were strung into necklaces, hinting that invention wasn't just practical, it was also about identity, pride, maybe even fashion. Turns out accessorizing has been around a lot longer than Instagram. And while we're on fashion, Tanning leather was another subtle but crucial invention. You picture hides stretched out, scraped clean, soaked in plant mixtures that softened them into wearable garments. Historians still debate whether this skill was learned deliberately or stumbled upon accidentally, perhaps from hides left too long in plant rich ponds. Either way, leather transformed from stiff skin to supple material, jackets, shoes, tents, another invention hiding in plain sight. Then there's glue. Yes, prehistoric glue. Imagine someone heating birch bark slowly, sticky tar oozing out, which could be used to haft stone points onto wooden shafts. Birch tar is technically one of the first chemical processes humans ever invented. One odd thing, chewing hardened tar was common, and scientists analyzing fossilized wads of chewed birch gum have reconstructed the DNA of the chewers, effectively listening to prehistory through their spit. Romantic, isn't it? Ropes and nets expanded possibilities even further. Early fiber cords were twisted from reeds, vines, or animal sinew. Nets for fishing allowed groups to catch food in bulk, shifting diets and freeing up time for other creative endeavors. Fun fact, the oldest known net dates back over 9,000 years and still carried intricate knotting techniques. You can almost see a community gathering to drag it from the water, fish wriggling in the moonlight, survival turned into routine. Now tilt your head and listen. Some of these bone and stone tools made rhythms, percussive beats, the sound of hammer on flint may have inspired music. That seems fanciful, but think of it, work becomes rhythm, rhythm becomes song, and not long after, humanity carved bone flutes, piercing the silence of Ice Age nights with melodies that echoed across valleys. Historians still argue whether music itself should be called an invention or an instinct. Birds sing, whales hum, but human music involves crafted instruments made from bone and wood, which implies deliberate invention. Some scholars insist it was as vital as hunting tools, because music bonded groups, reduced conflict, and soothed anxieties. And you listening to this are still part of that tradition, lulled by rhythm into calm. Let's not forget about the hammerstone, one of the most underestimated tools of all time. It was just a rock used to smash other rocks, but without it, no axe, blade, or scraper could exist. Sometimes the simplest inventions are the most essential. It's like the USB cable of prehistory. You never notice it until it's missing, and then suddenly nothing works. Odd little fact. Archaeologists often find hammerstones worn down smooth, almost polished by repeated use. Imagine a tool passed from parent to child for generations, a family heirloom long before written records. Containers show up here too, woven baskets, gourds hollowed and dried, even early pottery. The idea of storage changed everything. If you could carry water, hold berries, or save seeds, then you weren't bound to immediate consumption. You could plan, you could migrate, you could imagine tomorrow as something other than a threat. And tucked inside all this inventiveness is play. Small carved figurines, animals, humans, sometimes exaggerated in shape, were early toys or idols. Some argue they were religious symbols, others believe they were for teaching or amusement. Either way, the fact remains, even in harsh conditions, humanity invented time for creativity. Here's something curious. The earliest boomerangs weren't Australian. The oldest, found in Poland, is more than 20,000 years old. They were probably hunting tools, though not all returned when thrown. Still, the idea of designing flight paths was already in play. Imagine tossing one across a snowy field, watching it arc gracefully in the winter sky. So many of these bone and stone inventions seem simple, almost laughably basic, but they built the staircase humanity climbed. Fire and wheel may get all the glory, but without sharp edges, sewing needles, glue, ropes, nets, and containers, life would have been a brutal scramble. Each invention whispered, survive, adapt, thrive. Now picture yourself lying down again, stone flakes scattered around you, a bone needle tucked carefully into your pouch. The darkness outside is vast, but you feel secure. You have tools to cut, stitch, catch, carry, and play. You close your eyes, listening to the distant echo of someone tapping stone in rhythm, and realize you're already living in a world built by invention. Chimanda. You feel the crackle of stone and bone fade into silence, replaced by something softer, more deliberate, the scratch of a stylus on clay, the brush of ink on papyrus. If fire was the beginning of warmth and stone was the beginning of tools, then writing was the beginning of memory. You drift into a world where words don't vanish into the night air, but stay behind, pressed, carved, painted, anchors against forgetting. Imagine yourself in ancient Mesopotamia around 3200 BCE. A scribe bends over a damp clay tablet, pressing wedge-shaped symbols with a reed stylus. Each mark represents not just a sound, but a whole system of thought. Grain tallies, contracts, records of trade. Fun fact, the very first written words were not epic poems, but accounting notes. Humanity invented writing not for art, but for paperwork. So yes, bureaucracy is older than literature, but it didn't stop there. Over time, those wedge marks, cuneiform, began to carry stories. Kings, gods, heroes. The Epic of Gilgamesh unfurled across tablets, proof that invention can leap from practicality to poetry in just a few centuries. Historians still argue whether these early stories were meant to be read silently or always spoken aloud. Silent reading, as obvious as it seems to you, may not have existed at first. Words were meant to be heard, not hoarded inside one head. Travel a little farther in your drifting mind, and you arrive in Egypt. Here, papyrus plants line the Nile, tall stalks sliced, pressed, and dried into sheets. Papyrus scrolls replaced heavy clay tablets, light enough to carry across deserts. Odd fact, papyrus was so durable that scrolls thousands of years old can still be read today, while some of your digital files may not survive the next software update. Hieroglyphs appear, tiny pictures, elegant and complex. Unlike cuneiform's wedge marks, these were vibrant, sometimes playful. A bird wasn't just a sound, it was a bird. Imagine scribes carefully painting thousands of these characters, an entire workforce dedicated to maintaining the written world. Writing was power, and power wasn't for everyone. Fun fact, in some ancient societies, literacy was restricted to priests and officials. Knowledge wasn't free, it was locked behind walls of training and privilege. Meanwhile, in China, characters blossomed that were not alphabetic, but logographic symbols for words and concepts. Oracle bones, turtle shells, and bronze vessels carried inscriptions meant to communicate with ancestors. Odd little fact, some of the earliest Chinese characters have changed so little that modern readers can still recognize them. Imagine reading something written 3,000 years ago and nodding in recognition. It's like a secret handshake across millennia. Then comes the alphabet, a radical simplification. Instead of thousands of signs, just a couple dozen symbols could capture all sounds. The Phoenicians spread it across the Mediterranean, sailors carrying letters like cargo. Fun fact, the alphabet was one of history's most viral inventions, quickly adopted and adapted by Greeks, then Romans, then nearly everyone else. Without it, your text messages today would look a lot more like Egyptian walls than neat rows of letters. Historians debate whether the alphabet was truly a democratizing invention or simply another tool of control. Was it easier for the average person to learn? Maybe, but power structures still limited access. For most of human history, writing wasn't for the masses, it was for the elite. Only in recent centuries did literacy become something expected of everyone. Odd fact, the word book comes from the beech tree. Ancient Germanic tribes carved runes into beechwood tablets, and over time, book became book. So every time you crack open a paperback, you're whispering a forest into being. Writing also invented time travel. Through script, voices from centuries past can still speak to you now. Imagine a Babylonian astronomer recording star positions, or a Roman poet jotting a love poem. You can sit in the dark today, reading their words as if they were written for you personally. No invention other than fire has created such intimacy across time. And yet, writing wasn't universally celebrated. Some philosophers were suspicious of it. Fun fact, Socrates himself distrusted writing, fearing it would make people lazy thinkers, outsourcing memory instead of strengthening it. He preferred dialogue, the living breath of conversation. Ironically, we only know this because his student Plato wrote it down. Writing always wins in the end. One curious scholarly debate still stirs. Was writing invented independently in multiple places, or did it spread from one origin? Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, and Mesoamerica all developed forms of script seemingly without contact. Some argue for independent invention, others for cultural diffusion. The truth may never be fully clear, which feels fitting. Writing is as much mystery as record. Imagine holding a clay tablet, cool and heavy, the impressions under your fingertips like fingerprints of thought. Then picture unrolling a papyrus scroll, the crinkle of plant fibers, the ink faintly smudging your hand. Then think of parchment, smoother, softer, made from animal skin. Each shift in material reshaped how humanity stored ideas. And today, as you stare at glowing screens, you're still part of the same experiment, how to trap thought in matter. One last odd detail. Ancient scribes sometimes doodled. Margins carried sketches, jokes, even complaints. A tired Egyptian scribe once scribbled that his work was wretched. So next time you get bored in a meeting and doodle in your notebook, you're not being unprofessional. You're carrying on a tradition thousands of years old. Now the scratch of stylus fades again, and you lie back in your own time, surrounded not by scrolls or tablets, but by the hum of electricity. Still, every word you've ever read, every bedtime story whispered, traces back to those first marks on clay. Writing turned fleeting thought into something you could hold, something you could pass forward. Invention had become not just survival, but permanence. You drift now into a quieter kind of invention, the attempt to measure what cannot be held. Fire could be touched, wheels rolled across the ground, stone tools clinked in your palm. But time was invisible, relentless, slipping past like water between your fingers. Humanity's cleverness turned eventually to catching the uncatchable, to taming the rhythm of sun and shadow, moon and star. And you, resting in the dark, can almost hear the tick-tock of invention stretching back thousands of years. Imagine a shadow stretching across sand. That's the first clock. Long before wristwatches and smartphones, people watched how sunlight moved across the ground. Sundials were born when someone realized you could place a stick upright and let the shadow trace the hours. Fun fact, the oldest known sundials come from ancient Egypt around 1500 BCE, though people were watching shadows long before then. A stick in the ground is humble, yet it became humanity's first shared agreement on when. Oddly enough, sundials were far from perfect. They only worked when the sun shone, and they lied depending on the season. Winter shadows are longer, summer ones shorter, so noon in December didn't match noon in June. Historians still argue whether early sundials were meant to measure precise time or simply mark ritual points like when to pray, eat, or rest. Exact hours may not have mattered as much as social rhythm. Now float forward to the moonlit sky. Long before sundials, humanity had already invented calendars by watching lunar cycles. The waxing and waning moon was the world's first calendar in the heavens. Fun fact: bone fragments carved with notches, some over 20,000 years old, appear to be lunar records. Imagine someone scratching tiny marks with a flint, carefully tracking the moon's changes, trying to make sense of the passing nights. Calendars grew from moon to sun, from ritual to empire. The Egyptians aligned their year with the flooding of the Nile, anchoring agriculture to cosmic rhythm. The Maya created calendars so precise they tracked solar years to within 17 seconds of accuracy, without telescopes or satellites. Odd fact: their calendar famously sparked modern apocalypse theories in 2012, which shows how much people still project awe onto ancient timekeeping. The Romans, for their part, gave us the Julian calendar, a leap year system to fix seasonal drift. But it wasn't perfect. Over centuries, days slipped, seasons drifted. By the 1500s, Easter was sliding further from spring, a theological headache. The Gregorian reform corrected it, trimming days and reshaping leap years into the system you still live by today. One invention of emperors and popes quietly governs your work schedules and holidays every single year. But days and months weren't enough. Humanity wanted hours, minutes, moments carved even finer. Enter the water clock. Imagine a vessel with a tiny hole at the bottom, water dripping steadily into another container. The rise of liquid measured time's passage. Fun fact: water clocks, or clepsydras, existed in Egypt, Babylon, China, and Greece. Some were simple bowls, others grew elaborate with gears, dials, and even miniature automata moving in rhythm. One odd detail: ancient courts used water clocks to limit speeches. A speaker had as much time as the water took to drain. If you think modern politicians talk too long, imagine having a literal bucket of water to cut them off. From water, invention turned to sand. Hourglasses, with their elegant curves, appeared around the 8th century. Unlike sundials, they worked at night, and unlike water clocks, they didn't freeze in cold weather. Hourglasses became symbols of mortality, time slipping away, grain by grain. You picture yourself tilting one gently, sand trickling like stars across the night sky, a reminder that inventions are often metaphors as much as machines. Mechanical clocks arrived in medieval Europe, ringing bells across towns. At first, they weren't very accurate, often off by hours, but accuracy grew, gears refined, escapements invented. Fun fact: the Salisbury Cathedral clock, built around 1386, still ticks today, making it one of the oldest working mechanical clocks in the world. That steady tick isn't just metal, it's centuries of hands keeping rhythm. Then came pendulums. Galileo noticed the swing of a lamp in a cathedral, timing it with his pulse. His observations led Christian Huygens to invent the pendulum clock in 1656, cutting error to mere seconds per day. Suddenly, time was not just felt, it was dissected, pinned down with precision sharp as a blade. Historians argue this obsession with precision timekeeping fueled the Industrial Revolution itself, because trains, factories, and schedules required exact coordination. Odd fact: the phrase "killing time" would have puzzled ancient peoples. Time was sacred, cosmic, divine. Only once clocks became widespread did people begin to see time as something to waste, manage, or kill. Invention didn't just measure time, it reshaped how humanity thought about it. Eventually, clocks shrank into pockets and then wrists, until one day you check your phone and find time glowing on a screen without gears or shadows. Atomic clocks now measure time so precisely they lose less than a second in millions of years. Imagine explaining that to someone watching shadows on a sundial. It would sound like sorcery. One scholarly debate remains lively. Does invention shape perception, or does perception drive invention? Did sundials, calendars, and clocks invent time as we know it, or did they merely reflect an awareness already there? perhaps your own life, divided into minutes and deadlines, is simply a cultural byproduct of ticking machines. As you lie here, the soft hum of your fan becomes your own clepsydra, marking seconds with invisible rhythm. You feel the pulse of your heartbeat, the breath rising and falling, each cycle a reminder that even without sundials, without clocks, your body already keeps time. Humanity's inventions only mirrored what was already alive within you. You feel the ticking of ancient clocks fade, and suddenly you are walking through stone corridors where the air smells faintly of lime and dust. Here, the inventions are no longer just tools in one person's hand, they're sprawling marvels that stretch across landscapes. You've drifted into the age of empires, when invention didn't just help people survive, but built monuments, cities, and whole civilizations. Rome hums around you like a living machine, every stone carefully slotted into place. Imagine yourself at the edge of a Roman aqueduct. It arches across the valley, elegant and precise, water flowing silently across miles. Fun fact, some aqueducts carried water for over 50 miles, supplying baths, fountains, and households. Gravity did all the work. No pumps, no engines, just perfectly calculated slopes. Stand there long enough, and you'd see entire cities drinking from one invention. Odd fact, one aqueduct, the Aqua Virgo, built in 19 BCE, still functions today, feeding Rome's Trevi Fountain. 2,000 years of continuous service makes your smartphone battery look pretty unimpressive. Concrete, too, was Rome's secret weapon. Ordinary stone can be stacked, but Roman concrete was poured. Made with volcanic ash, lime, and water, it hardened even underwater, allowing harbors and bridges that still stand. Fun fact, the Pantheon's dome, built nearly 1900 years ago, is still the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world. Modern engineers keep scratching their heads at how durable Roman concrete is compared to some crumbling highways built in the last 50 years. Historians still argue whether Roman concrete was deliberately formulated to last millennia, or if it was a happy accident of volcanic chemistry. Some studies suggest the concrete heals itself when water seeps in, reactivating lime pockets. Imagine that, a building material with regenerative powers like Wolverine, but made of ash and dust. Now picture Roman roads cutting straight lines across Europe and beyond. All roads lead to Rome wasn't just poetry, it was infrastructure. Over 250,000 miles of roads laced the empire, layered with gravel, stone, and sand for durability. Fun fact, some stretches of Roman roads are still used today, their foundations outlasting countless kingdoms. You almost hear the clatter of sandals, the rumble of chariots, the creak of wagons, all inventions moving on. Another invention. Oddly enough, Roman road design influenced modern highways. The basic layering system is echoed in asphalt construction today. Your morning commute is essentially a sequel to Roman engineering. Then, there were arches. Simple, elegant, strong. The arch distributed weight outward, allowing bridges, aqueducts, and amphitheaters to soar higher and wider than flat beams ever could. Walk under the Colosseum's arches, and you feel the quiet confidence of geometry. Without the arch, skyscrapers might never have risen. Every tall building is secretly borrowing from Roman math. Fun fact, the Colosseum could seat about 50,000 people, with awnings rigged to shade them from the sun. It had elevators and trapdoors beneath the arena floor, powered by pulleys and counterweights. Imagine watching lions, gladiators, and scenery rising through hidden lifts, basically the world's first stage machinery. But invention wasn't only monumental. Everyday Roman life buzzed with cleverness. Heated floors. Yes, central heating existed 2,000 years ago. Wealthy houses used a system called the hypocaust, where hot air from a furnace circulated under floors and through walls. You lying under your blanket right now are enjoying a comfort the Romans already invented. Odd fact, Roman surgeons had scalpels, forceps, even catheters, some eerily similar to modern tools. Archaeologists have unearthed surgical kits that wouldn't look too out of place in a hospital drawer today. You can almost hear the clink of metal against a tray, the quiet assurance that invention has always touched medicine. Rome also popularized glass blowing, turning molten sand into cups, bottles, and windows. Fun fact, the Romans were among the first to use transparent glass in windows, changing architecture by letting in light while keeping out weather. Before that, homes were lit only by openings or oiled cloth. Imagine the joy of seeing sunshine through glass for the first time. It must have felt like catching a piece of the sky. Historians debate whether Rome was truly inventive or just good at systematizing earlier discoveries. They borrowed Greek mathematics, Egyptian techniques, and Mesopotamian knowledge, then scaled it all up. Maybe their genius wasn't invention in the eureka sense, but integration, building a machine of civilization out of borrowed parts. Still, there are odd little touches of Roman creativity. For example, they invented fast food. Yes, thermopolia, street-side counters with embedded jars of hot food, were the ancient equivalent of takeout. Archaeologists found frescoes, advertising dishes, basically prehistoric menu boards. You imagine Romans grabbing a quick bowl of stew before heading to the baths, grumbling about the price, same as today. Speaking of baths, the baths themselves were marvels, vast complexes with hot and cold pools, steam rooms, exercise courts. In some, ceilings dripped condensation onto marble floors, and mosaics glittered under lamplight. The invention wasn't just plumbing, it was public leisure, a social space engineered for community. And don't forget books. Romans adopted and spread the codex, pages bound together instead of rolled into scrolls. This simple invention revolutionized reading. Imagine flipping instead of unrolling, bookmarking instead of rewinding. Fun fact, early Christians favored codex over scrolls, which helped spread both the format and the faith. Odd fact, Romans also had vending machines, sort of. Hero of Alexandria, a Greek-Egyptian inventor working under Roman rule, designed a coin-operated machine that dispensed holy water. Insert a coin, a lever tipped, and out poured your allotted splash. Next time you buy a soda, you're echoing ancient ritual. As you drift, the empire hums around you, roads stretching like veins, aqueducts like arteries, concrete bones, arches lifting rib cages of stone. Rome itself becomes a body of invention, alive and breathing, and like every body, it will eventually fall, but its skeleton remains, scattered across the world. You close your eyes and still feel it, the weight of stone above you, the steady trickle of water, the faint warmth under your feet from hidden furnaces. You've wandered into a civilization that built comfort and spectacle out of invention, leaving behind ruins that are less ruin than whisper. Barapasau bleds, the twerks recarstropoli. The stones of Rome settle into dust behind you, and now you drift into the rustle of paper, the scent of ink, and the hush of words multiplying like fireflies in the night. If writing carved memory into clay and papyrus, printing turned it into a flood. You find yourself in a dim workshop, the air thick with the smell of oil and ink, wooden letters laid out in trays ready to be pressed. This is where knowledge stops being the privilege of the few and begins its long march toward the many. Picture China in the 9th century, blocks of wood carved in reverse, coated in ink, pressed onto paper. Each page was a mirror impression, carefully stamped. Fun fact, the world's first printed book with a date is the Diamond Sutra, printed in 868 CE. That's more than 500 years before Gutenberg's press. The pages still exist, paper so thin it seems ready to vanish at a breath, yet words still cling to it like whispers from another age. Odd fact, Chinese printers sometimes carved entire books into one massive woodblock, flipping pages by swapping giant planks of wood. It was efficient for reprinting the same text, but imagine needing a warehouse to store your library. Makes your overloaded Kindle look feather light. Move forward in your drifting mind, and you arrive in 11th century China again, where Bai Sheng invents movable type, tiny ceramic pieces for each character, rearranged as needed. It was brilliant, but because Chinese script uses thousands of characters, movable type didn't spread quickly there. In alphabet-based systems, though, with only a few dozen symbols, it would explode. And so we reach Europe in the mid-1400s, where Johannes Gutenberg, a goldsmith with a restless mind, invents the press that will reshape everything. Metal movable type, an oil-based ink that clung to paper, and a screw press adapted from winemaking. It all came together in one invention. Fun fact, Gutenberg's press could produce around 3,600 pages a day, compared to perhaps 40 by hand. Suddenly, books weren't rare treasures. They were replicable, distributable, unstoppable. Historians still argue whether Gutenberg himself realized the revolutionary power of what he built. Did he know his press would help spark the Reformation, spread scientific ideas, and ignite revolutions, or was he just trying to make a living printing Bibles? Some scholars argue that printers were seen less as visionaries and more as businessmen. Either way, the ripple turned into a tidal wave. Odd fact, one of the first big sellers after religious texts, indulgent slips, printed documents that granted forgiveness in exchange for payment. Printing wasn't only about spreading enlightenment, it was also about monetizing faith. Some things, it seems, never change. The printing press democratized words, but also destabilized power. Martin Luther's 95 Theses spread like wildfire because of printing. Pamphlets became viral before viral even existed. You could almost say Gutenberg invented the first meme format, short, repeatable, shareable text that disrupted the establishment. Fun fact, printers sometimes included typos on purpose, small variations that let them track copies like watermarks. Those mistakes are now gold mines for scholars tracing the spread of texts. In other words, history was partly built on misprints. Paper itself deserves attention here. Invented in China around the 2nd century BCE, paper spread slowly westward, reaching Europe much later. Before paper, parchment and vellum, animal skins, dominated, heavy and expensive. Paper was lighter, cheaper, easier to mass produce. Odd detail, early European paper often had visible watermarks, not for branding, but as proof of quality and origin. Imagine every page of your notebook carrying a ghostly logo in its fibers. Books change shape too, from scrolls to codices, then to printed volumes. Each transition reshaped how knowledge was consumed. A scroll must be unrolled, linear and continuous. A codex, pages bound at one edge, allows flipping, cross-referencing, even skimming. Printing pressed that format into permanence, making books not just vessels of knowledge, but tools for thought. Fun fact, the spread of printed books directly influenced spelling. Before printing, words varied wildly by region. Printers froze certain spellings in type, and slowly those became standard. In other words, your spelling tests in school trace back to Gutenberg's workshop. Odd fact, people didn't immediately trust printed books. Some thought machine-made words were less authentic than handwritten manuscripts. For a time, scribes continued to copy books by hand because wealthy patrons preferred the aura of manual labor. You imagine a scribe muttering, "These printed things will never catch on," while a pile of books quietly proves them wrong. Historians debate whether printing created the modern concept of authorship. Before, texts were copied, adapted, rewritten without clear ownership. With print, works became fixed editions, and the idea of a single named author gained importance. Did invention shape identity here too? Perhaps your favorite novel would feel less yours without the concept of a definitive author. And then there's the human side. Libraries blossomed, literacy slowly expanded, and ideas leapt borders. Galileo's writings, banned in one city, popped up in another. Descartes, Shakespeare, Cervantes, all flowed across the press. Imagine the thrill of holding a book in 1500, fresh ink staining your fingers, the smell of paper sharp and earthy, the words crisp and black, promising 1,000 voices captured inside. One quirky fact: early books were sometimes chained to desks in libraries. Not because librarians were cruel, but because books were valuable, worth as much as a horse. You picture readers bent over, tugging against iron chains, devouring knowledge while tethered like dogs at a post. As you lie back in your own century, you feel the hum of invention ripple through you. The glow of your screen is just another page, your scrolling thumb the echo of flipping leaves. The press didn't just make books, it made the modern mind, a world where knowledge is expected to flow freely, whether by page, pixel, or whispered bedtime story. You drift now into a quieter workshop, one filled with shimmering shards and the delicate sound of glass being shaped by breath. The fire glows in a furnace, sand melts, and artisans spin it into something transparent. Glass was already an ancient craft, but here it transforms into a portal, bending light, magnifying vision, letting humanity peer into the unseen. This is where invention doesn't just change your hands or your tools, it changes your eyes. Picture a monk in the late 13th century, squinting at his manuscript, eyes tired from years of copying by candlelight. Then imagine him slipping on a pair of crude lenses mounted in frames, spectacles. Fun fact: eyeglasses were invented in Italy around 1086, though the exact inventor remains a mystery. Suddenly, lives lengthened not by medicine, but by clarity. A scholar could keep working, a craftsman keep carving, a weaver keep weaving. Oddly enough, some medieval people viewed glasses as symbols of wisdom, not frailty. Wearing them meant you were serious, learned, basically the ancient version of looking intellectual. From there, lenses only grew more ambitious. In the early 17th century, Dutch spectacle makers combined lenses in tubes, giving birth to telescopes. Galileo, with one of these instruments, turned it skyward and found mountains on the moon, moons orbiting Jupiter, and stars scattered far more densely than the naked eye ever suggested. Fun fact: Galileo's telescope magnified about 20 times, far weaker than even a cheap backyard telescope today, yet it rewrote humanity's place in the cosmos. Historians still argue who deserves credit for the telescope. Some say Hans Lippershey, a Dutch spectacle maker. Others argue multiple people were tinkering with the same idea simultaneously. Invention often seems less like a lightning strike and more like a storm brewing across many minds. Odd fact: Galileo's discoveries rattled the church, not because of the telescope itself, but because it confirmed Copernicus's idea that Earth orbited the sun. Imagine peering into a little tube of glass and finding an idea dangerous enough to shake empires. Now tilt your vision the other way, not outward but inward. In the 17th century, Antony van Leeuwenhoek, a Dutch tradesman, polished tiny lenses so powerful they revealed a hidden world. He peered at pond water and saw animalcules, microorganisms swimming in every drop. Fun fact: his single-lens microscopes were so finely crafted they magnified up to 270 times, far beyond his peers. He wasn't a scientist by training, but his curiosity made him the first human ever to witness bacteria, sperm cells, blood circulation, and capillaries. Basically, he he invented the backstage pass to life itself. Historians debate whether Leeuwenhoek truly invented the microscope or just perfected it. Earlier compound microscopes existed, but his skill at lens grinding outstripped everyone else. Sometimes invention isn't creating something new, but doing something old so well it becomes revolutionary. Odd little fact, early microscopes also created illusions. Observers thought they saw tiny creatures inside semen with heads and tails already formed. Homunculi, little people curled inside sperm cells. The idea was wrong, of course, but it shows how invention always runs ahead of understanding. You could say microscopes magnified imagination as much as reality. Glass bent not only science but art. Painters used camera obscura devices, dark boxes with pinholes projecting inverted images to trace landscapes. Fun fact, some scholars argue that artists like Vermeer may have secretly used optical aids to achieve uncanny realism. Invention didn't just show reality, it shaped how reality was represented. Lighthouses, too, owe their brilliance to glass. The Fresnel lens, invented in the 1820s, concentrated beams so powerfully that a single lamp could be seen for miles across the sea. Sailors called them the invention that saved 1,000,000 ships. Picture standing on a cliff, watching the beams sweep across the night like a blade of light. Glass turned into guardian. Odd fact, early spectacle wearers were mocked as four eyes even centuries ago, proof that invention always carries stigma alongside salvation. Yet glasses never went away, they just became fashion. Your modern sunglasses are distant cousins of those medieval lenses, proof that practicality and vanity often share a frame. Historians still puzzle over the leap from magnifying glass to full telescope. Why did it take so long for someone to point two lenses at the stars? Perhaps it was timing, glass quality, grinding techniques, curiosity, all converging in the right century. Invention often hides not in possibility, but in patience. One quirky fact, the first contact lenses were imagined by Leonardo da Vinci in 1508. He sketched ideas for correcting vision by submerging the eye in a bowl of water or wearing glass lenses over it. The concept was far ahead of his time, but today millions of people wear versions of that dream in their eyes every day. Now close your own eyes and imagine seeing the invisible. Stars dancing in spirals, galaxies burning like distant campfires, microbes darting like fireflies in a drop of water. Through glass, the universe cracked open both ways, macro and micro. You hold in your mind not just what you can see, but what invention has taught you to see. The hum of your fan is steady, your room dim, yet you carry in your imagination moons circling Jupiter, bacteria swarming in a droplet, beams of light slicing through fog. Lenses taught humanity that the universe is always more than it appears, that reality hides in layers, waiting for invention to peel them back. You drift into a haze of smoke and steam, the air thick with coal dust and the hiss of pistons. The quiet tinkering of glass and ink is gone. Now invention roars. This is the machine age, the great turning of gears that reshaped not only how humanity worked, but how it lived, ate, traveled, and even thought. The rhythm of this section isn't a whisper, but a thrum, the steady pulse of industry beating across continents. It begins in Britain in the late 18th century, though its roots stretch back centuries. Picture coal mines deep underground, black dust staining the skin, miners hauling up the fuel that would ignite an empire. Coal fed the furnaces, and furnaces fed invention. Fun fact, one of the earliest steam engines, Thomas Newcomen's atmospheric engine in 1712, was built just to pump water out of mines. At first, it wasn't about powering cities, it was about keeping tunnels dry. Enter James Watt in the 1760s. He tinkered with Newcomen's design, adding a separate condenser that made the engine far more efficient. Fun fact, Watt's name lives on today in the unit of power, the watt. Though he didn't invent the steam engine itself, he perfected it. That small improvement unlocked enormous consequences. Steam began to move wheels, pistons, gears. Soon machines powered not by muscle or water, but by vapor spread across factories. Odd fact, the first steam locomotives terrified people. Early passengers worried that traveling at more than 30 miles per hour would suffocate them. Newspapers warned that cows grazing by the tracks would stop producing milk out of fright. Yet within decades, trains stitched together towns and nations, shrinking journeys from weeks to days. The textile industry was one of the first to embrace machines, spinning jennies, power looms, cotton gins, all multiplying human productivity by staggering amounts. Fun fact, the spinning jenny, invented by James Hargreaves in 1764, could spin 8 threads at once. Later versions managed dozens, even hundreds. The odd fact here, riots often broke out against these machines. Workers called them the devil's mills, fearing unemployment. That resistance gave rise to the Luddites, who smashed looms in protest. Historians still argue whether the Luddites were anti-technology or simply anti-exploitation. Many believe they weren't against machines themselves, but against how factory owners used them to drive down wages and working conditions. It's a reminder that inventions don't exist in a vacuum. They live in the messy tension between progress and people. Coal and iron forged new landscapes. Bridges stretched across rivers, canals carved through countryside, and cities mushroomed around mills. The smell of smoke became as ordinary as the smell of bread. Fun fact, the first iron bridge, built in 1779 over the River Severn in England, still stands today. It's a monument not just to engineering, but to a shift in imagination. Suddenly, structures of pure iron were possible. Factories also reshaped time. Clocks ticked before, but now whistles and bells regulated every worker's hour. Instead of sunrise and sunset, people lived by the rhythm of shifts. Odd fact, some workers in the early 1800s petitioned against using clocks in mills, preferring natural light as their measure. But the machine age wasn't interested in nature, it was interested in efficiency. Steamships followed railways, turning oceans into highways. Fun fact, the first transatlantic steamship crossing in 1819 still relied on sails for most of the journey. But within decades, steam conquered seas, making schedules reliable where wind had once ruled. Commerce tightened, migration expanded, empires stretched even farther. Historians debate whether the Industrial Revolution truly improved life for ordinary people in its early stages. Infant mortality stayed high, cities were filthy, and factory conditions were brutal. Was invention liberating or enslaving? The answer depends on whose story you tell, the factory owners or the child laborers. Progress always leaves a shadow. Odd fact, early locomotives were given almost comical names. The Rocket, Puffing Billy, as if the world wasn't yet ready to see them as ordinary machines. They were novelties, spectacles, like giant mechanical beasts snorting steam. Crowds gathered just to watch them pass, much as we now stop to watch rockets launch. One subtle invention of this age was interchangeable parts. Eli Whitney, known for the cotton gin, popularized the idea in gun manufacturing, making identical pieces so broken weapons could be repaired quickly. Fun fact, this principle eventually made assembly lines possible. Without it, Henry Ford's cars would never have rolled off factories in neat, identical rows. Coal smoke filled lungs, but it also filled bank accounts. The machine age powered empires, but also inequality. Children as young as 6 worked in factories, their tiny hands darting between moving parts. Oddly, reform only came slowly. often after horrifying accidents. Invention ran ahead, while ethics limped behind. Historians still argue about why Britain became the birthplace of industrialization. Was it coal, colonies, capital, or culture? Likely it was all of them in messy combination. What's certain is that once gears began to turn, the world could not go back. You can almost hear the hiss of steam still, like the steady breath of a giant machine that never truly shut down. And as you rest in your own century, with electric hum replacing coal smoke, you can feel the ghost of that transformation. The factory whistle echoes faintly in your 9 to 5. The train's clatter lingers in your daily commute. The machine age is never really past. It's still here, hidden in the rhythm of modern life. The roar of steam and iron slowly fades, and now you feel a different hum, a softer, sharper buzz, like invisible rivers running through copper veins. The air is charged. You drift into the age of electricity, where sparks leap from wires, lamps glow like bottled suns, and voices travel across distances without bodies. If the machine age built the skeleton of modern life, electricity gave it a nervous system. Imagine sitting in a room in the mid-19th century, lit only by candles or gas lamps. The air is smoky, shadows dance unpredictably, and every flame is a tiny risk of fire. Then suddenly, click, a light bulb glows. The room fills with steady, clean radiance. Fun fact, Thomas Edison didn't invent the light bulb outright. Dozens of inventors had experimented with glowing filaments before him. But Edison perfected the design and, more importantly, built the entire system around it. Power plants, wiring, sockets. Without the grid, the bulb would have been a useless trick. Odd fact, Edison once electrocuted an elephant named Topsy to demonstrate the dangers of alternating current, AC, during his feud with Nikola Tesla. Yes, the war of currents wasn't just about science, it was about showmanship, fear, and a little cruelty. Historians still shake their heads at how far Edison went to promote direct current DC. Tesla, meanwhile, envisioned something bolder. His alternating current system could carry power over long distances with far less loss. Fun fact, the Niagara Falls power plant, completed in 1895, was one of the first major AC projects, sending electricity 25 miles to Buffalo, New York. People thought harnessing a waterfall to power an entire city was near magical. Historians still argue whether Tesla has been over-romanticized in modern culture. Was he a misunderstood genius, unfairly overshadowed, or a brilliant mind who often overreached? Either way, his alternating current won, and the hum in your walls today is his legacy. The telegraph deserves a moment here. Before phones, before the internet, there was the tap-tap of Morse code racing along wires. Fun fact, Samuel Morse's first official telegraph message in 1844 was "What hath God wrought?" People were stunned. Words traveling faster than horses, faster than trains, almost as fast as thought itself. The world suddenly felt smaller. Odd fact, telegraph operators developed their own slang and even relationships through Morse code conversations. Some called it the Victorian Internet. Imagine falling in love with someone you've never seen, only tapped across a wire. The telephone followed in 1876, with Alexander Graham Bell's famous call to his assistant, "Mr. Watson, come here, I want to see you." Fun fact, Bell originally thought the telephone would mainly be useful for transmitting music. He didn't anticipate how much people just wanted to talk. Within decades, telephone wires stretched like spiderwebs across cities, voices buzzing through copper lines. Historians debate whether Bell truly invented the phone first. An inventor named Elisha Gray filed a similar patent the same day. Some argue Bell got the credit because his paperwork hit the desk a few hours earlier. Invention, it seems, sometimes depends on timing down to the minute. Electricity wasn't only about light and communication. Factories roared with electric motors, homes buzzed with appliances, and cities shimmered like constellations come to Earth. Fun fact, the first electric toaster was patented in 1909. It could only toast one side of the bread at a time, but breakfast was forever changed. Odd fact, some early electrified cities deliberately kept a few gas lamps burning in case the new system failed. People didn't quite trust the invisible current yet. To them, fire felt real, electricity felt ghostly. The electric chair, grim but notable, was another invention of the age. First used in 1890, it was meant as a more humane execution method than hanging. Historians still argue whether it was science misapplied or just society seeking cleaner ways to do the same old violence. It's a reminder that invention doesn't always illuminate, it can also burn. Fun fact, the first neon signs appeared in Paris in 1910, glowing tubes bent into letters that turned city nights into glowing canvases. For decades, neon was the very symbol of modernity, buzzing above diners and theaters, promising life after dark. Odd fact, some people in the late 19th century believed electricity had health benefits. They bought electric belts and electrotherapy devices, promising vitality and youth. Spoiler, they didn't work, but the placebo glow was apparently strong enough to sell thousands. Historians still debate whether Edison and Tesla were rivals or simply playing different games. Edison was a businessman, Tesla a dreamer. One built systems people could use, the other imagined futures most couldn't yet grasp. Perhaps humanity needed both, the pragmatist and the visionary, to electrify the world. And as you lie there listening to the soft buzz of your own devices, phone charging, fan humming, you can feel the echo of that revolution. Every glowing pixel on your screen is a descendant of those first flickers of filament. The wires humming outside your window are threads of a web that began with sparks leaping from coils in forgotten laboratories. Electricity didn't just banish darkness, it rewrote what it meant to be human. Nights grew longer, cities grew brighter, voices grew nearer. The world became charged, buzzing, restless, awake, and you, in your dim room, are still part of that current, drifting on the soft hum of invention's glow. The glow of electric bulbs lingers behind you as you drift into the steady rumble of wheels, the hiss of pistons, and the deep growl of engines. Now the story turns to motion machines that carry you faster, farther, higher than any horse or sail ever could. If electricity rewired the nervous system of civilization, transportation became its beating heart, pumping people and goods across the veins of the planet. You begin with something humble, the bicycle. 2 wheels, pedals, a frame, and suddenly freedom. Fun fact, the earliest version of the bicycle, the loft machine or dandy horse, was invented in 1817 by Carl Dries. It had no pedals, riders pushed along with their feet like a toddler on a balance bike. Odd fact, the invention arose partly because of a climate disaster after the 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora caused a year without summer, horses starved, and people needed alternatives for transport. So yes, in a way, a volcano helped invent the bike. The safety bicycle of the 1880s with pedals, a chain drive, and equal-sized wheels changed everything. Suddenly women had mobility, social boundaries loosened, and clothing even shifted. Historians still argue whether bicycles did more for women's independence than some political reforms. Imagine pedaling down a dirt road in 1890, wind on your face, the horizon no longer bound to walking distance. Then comes the train, iron horses thundering across the landscape. George Stephenson's rocket locomotive in 1829 reached a blistering 30 miles per hour, fast enough that newspapers warned it might cause brain damage to passengers. Fun fact, Early train companies didn't bother building toilets on carriages. Journeys were short, and passengers were expected to hold it, odd given how quickly rail stretched into days-long treks. Historians still debate whether railroads created modern time. Before trains, local time was set by the sun. Noon in one town might be 12:15 in the next. Trains needed schedules, and schedules needed standardized time zones. By the 1880s, the world ticked in unison, all thanks to steel tracks and steam whistles. Now picture the car sputtering into life in the late 19th century. Carl Benz patented his motor wagon in 1886, a three-wheeled contraption with a one-cylinder engine. Fun fact, his wife Bertha Benz made the first long-distance drive in 1888, secretly taking the car 66 miles to her mother's house. Along the way, she refueled at a pharmacy. Gasoline was sold as cleaning fluid back then, unclogged a fuel line with her hat pin, and had a blacksmith fix the chain. In doing so, she basically invented the road trip. Odd fact, early cars had no steering wheels. Drivers used tillers like a boat rudder. Imagine parallel parking with that. No wonder accidents were common. Henry Ford's assembly line in 1913 transformed cars from luxury toys into everyday tools. A Model T cost about $800 away. By the 1920s, it dropped below $300, affordable for ordinary families. Cars reshaped cities, gave rise to suburbs, and spread the smell of gasoline across the globe. Historians still debate whether Ford liberated workers or trapped them in mechanical monotony. His assembly lines paid well, but demanded soul-numbing repetition, and then the sky. Humans had dreamed of flight for millennia, strapping wings to arms, leaping from towers, imagining feathers might carry them. Finally, in 1903 at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, the Wright brothers' plane lifted for 12 seconds, covering 120 feet. Fun fact, their first flight was shorter than the wingspan of a modern Boeing 747. Yet in that short hop, the world became airborne. Odd fact, most newspapers didn't bother covering the Wrights' flights at first. Editors thought the idea of heavier-than-air flight was too ridiculous to waste ink on. Within a decade, though, planes were in the skies over Europe, transforming warfare, mail, and eventually tourism. Historians still argue whether Santos Dumont, a Brazilian inventor, should share credit with the Wrights. In 1906, he publicly flew in Paris before a crowd, earning acclaim. The Wrights, working more privately, didn't demonstrate widely until later. Again, Invention's story is tangled. Part genius, part timing, part spectacle. Airplanes grew fast. Wood and fabric biplanes became roaring metal birds by the 1930s, capable of crossing oceans. Fun fact, Charles Lindbergh's solo transatlantic flight in 1927 took over 33 hours, with him staying awake the whole time by splashing water on his face. Compare that to a modern jet doing it in under 7 hours while you nap, watch movies, and complain about legroom. And don't forget ships. Steamships replaced sails, turning oceans from unpredictable journeys into scheduled passages. The first propeller-driven steamship crossed the Atlantic in 1845, faster and steadier than clippers. Trade exploded, migration surged, and the world's map shrank. Odd fact, the RMS Titanic, before its tragic fate, used over 800 tons of coal a day to power its engines. The ship was less an ocean vessel and more a floating factory of fire. From 2 wheels to 4 wheels to wings, the 19th and early 20th centuries collapsed distance. You could wake in one city, sleep in another, and perhaps even cross oceans in a week. The human horizon expanded so quickly it must have felt dizzying. Historians sometimes call it the annihilation of space by time. And yet, as you lie here now, the hum of a car passing outside, the distant rumble of a plane overhead, the clatter of a train rolling somewhere in the night, you feel how ordinary these miracles have become. Your ancestors would have wept with wonder at what you consider traffic noise. Invention shrinks the world, but it also makes wonder shrink with it. Unless, of course, you pause, like now, and remember the magic hidden in the engines that fly. The growl of engines fades, and now you drift into quieter halls, white-tiled laboratories, apothecary shelves, the sharp scent of herbs and chemicals. Here the inventions don't roar or glow, they save. This is the world of medicine, where glass vials, careful needles, and bottled cures reshaped not just individual lives, but the very arc of human survival. For most of history, illness was a shadow with no name. Plagues swept through towns, fevers burned unchecked, wounds festered. Then came one of humanity's most remarkable inventions, the vaccine. Fun fact, Edward Jenner in 1796 observed that milkmaids who caught cowpox didn't get smallpox. He scraped fluid from a cowpox blister, inoculated a young boy, and watched the deadly disease fail to take hold. It was crude, even reckless by today's standards, but it worked. Vaccination became the first invention to systematically prevent disease rather than just treat symptoms. Odd fact, the term vaccine comes from vacca, Latin for cow, so every shot you've had carries a linguistic reminder of the humble bovine. Historians still argue about whether Jenner truly discovered vaccination or simply built on long-standing folk practices. In parts of Asia and Africa, people had experimented with inoculation by introducing small amounts of disease long before Europe. Jenner systematized it, but the roots run deep and wide. Anesthesia was another leap. Imagine surgery before ether, surgeons racing against screams, patients strapped down. In 1846, William T. G. Morton demonstrated ether anesthesia in Boston. Fun fact, the operation was a tumor removal on a patient's neck, and the man reportedly felt nothing. The crowd of doctors was stunned. Some even doubted it, thinking he must be faking. Within a few decades, anesthesia spread across the world, making once unthinkable operations routine. Odd fact, early anesthetics included chloroform, sometimes administered on handkerchiefs. Queen Victoria used it during childbirth in 1853, lending royal approval to the practice. Yet it wasn't without risks. Chloroform overdoses killed patients, reminding everyone that even life-saving inventions carry danger. And then the discovery that invisible organisms cause disease, a revolution sparked by microscopes and sharpened by science. Louis Pasteur in France and Robert Koch in Germany showed that germs, not bad air or curses, spread illness. Fun fact, Pasteur also invented pasteurization, heating liquids like milk to kill harmful microbes. Every carton in your fridge today is an echo of his laboratory flasks. Historians debate whether the germ theory instantly transformed medicine. In reality, many doctors resisted washing hands or sterilizing instruments, thinking it unnecessary. Ignaz Semmelweis, who championed hand washing in maternity wards in the 1840s, was mocked and eventually institutionalized. Oddly enough, the very idea that invisible things could kill was too strange for many to accept. Then came antibiotics, the true game changer. In 1928, Alexander Fleming noticed that a mold, Penicillium notatum, killed bacteria in a petri dish. Fun fact, he almost ignored it, thinking it a minor curiosity, but penicillin would become the first mass-produced antibiotic, saving millions of lives during World War II and beyond. Soldiers wounded on the battlefield no longer faced certain death from infection. Odd fact, before penicillin was widely available, doctors sometimes recycled it. Patients' urine, rich in the drug, was collected, extracted, and reused for others. Resourceful, if slightly unsettling. Historians still argue whether antibiotics were humanity's greatest medical invention or its most precarious. Overuse has bred resistant superbugs, threatening to undo the miracle. The invention was powerful, but it demands stewardship, a reminder that every cure carries its own shadow. Vaccines, anesthesia, germ theory, antibiotics. Together, they reshaped life expectancy. Fun fact, in 1900, the average global lifespan hovered around 30 to 35 years. By the 21st century, it more than doubled. Not because humans changed, but because our inventions finally kept death at bay. Odd fact, not all cures came in bottles or vials. The stethoscope, invented by René Laennec in 1816, was originally just a wooden tube. He created it because he found it inappropriate to press his ear directly against a female patient's chest. That modest wooden cylinder became an enduring symbol of medicine. Historians debate whether medicine is truly invention-driven or discovery-driven. Was penicillin invented when Fleming noticed it, or discovered by chance? Was anesthesia an invention, or simply the harnessing of natural vapors? Perhaps medicine sits in the middle, curiosity finding what nature already offers, then refining it into tools humanity can wield. Fun fact, insulin, discovered in 1921, transformed diabetes from a death sentence into a manageable condition. The first patients injected were near death, and within days regained vitality. Oddly, dogs played a crucial role in early experiments, their pancreases removed to study insulin's function. Without them, the leap might have come later. You pause here in the story, feeling the quiet gratitude woven into every pill, every shot, every sterile syringe. These inventions aren't flashy engines or glowing lights. They're the silent shields between you and 1,000 lurking dangers. Your heartbeat, steady now, carries within it the echoes of laboratories and needles, the hope bottled by countless hands who refused to accept that illness was destiny. And as the night hums around you, you realize this truth. The story of invention is also the story of survival. Every cure in a bottle is not just chemistry, it's a whispered promise that life can stretch further, that humanity can keep going, one fragile body at a time. The faint scent of antiseptic in glass vials lingers, then fades, replaced by a strange invisible pulse in the air. You drift into an age when sound itself began to travel without wires, when moving pictures flickered into living rooms, and when the silence of distance was broken by waves you cannot see, but can certainly hear. This is the story of signals across the air, the inventions that made the planet feel suddenly smaller, cozier, and sometimes louder. Imagine sitting in a parlor in the early 1900s, a heavy wooden box with knobs at the center of attention, crackling static, then miraculously voices, music, news, all carried by radio waves. Fun fact, Guglielmo Marconi sent the first transatlantic radio signal in 1901 from England to Newfoundland. Skeptics thought the Earth's curvature made it impossible, yet the signal leapt across. Oddly enough, it was just 3 dots in Morse code, the letter S, but it was proof the air could carry meaning across oceans. Odd fact, ships soon relied heavily on radio. When the Titanic sank in 1912, its distress signals reached faraway vessels, though not soon enough for all to be saved. Still, radio made tragedy audible in real time, a haunting reminder that invention can't always outrun disaster. Historians still argue who truly invented the radio. Nikola Tesla, Marconi, and several lesser-known inventors all worked on wireless transmission at the same time. Patent battles raged, and even the US Supreme Court weighed in, eventually crediting Tesla. But the truth may be that no single person invented it. It was a chorus of overlapping experiments. The radio quickly became a household companion. Fun fact, by the 1930s, Families gathered nightly around it the way we gather around streaming services today. Fireside chats, jazz broadcasts, baseball games. It was the original shared media. Odd fact, the famous 1938 War of the Worlds broadcast by Orson Welles allegedly caused mass panic, with listeners believing Martians were invading. Historians debate how widespread the panic truly was, but it shows how powerful the new medium felt. Voices from nowhere carried authority, even terror. Then came the telephone, perfected earlier but now amplified by radio waves. No longer tethered by copper wires, voices leapt across cities, then countries. Fun fact, the first mobile phone call was made in 1973 by Martin Cooper of Motorola, using a brick-sized device weighing over 2 pounds. He called a rival engineer at Bell Labs just to brag, "I'm talking to you on a real cell phone." Odd fact, early cell towers were disguised as trees in suburban areas to avoid upsetting landscapes. To this day, you may pass a strangely symmetrical pine tree and not realize it's transmitting your TikToks and emails. Historians still argue whether the telephone or the radio changed human connection more. One gave us direct voice-to-voice intimacy, the other collective experience. Perhaps both were needed, one for whispering secrets, the other for shouting to the crowd. And then, pictures began to move. The television, flickering black and white in the 1930s, transformed storytelling. Fun fact, the first TV broadcast in the US featured a man with a ventriloquist's dummy reciting nursery rhymes. Hardly glamorous, but it proved the box could carry more than sound. It could carry faces. Odd fact, many early TV sets were sold without programming available. People bought them simply to own the future, staring at static until broadcasts caught up. Imagine buying a car before roads exist, just to brag that you have one in the driveway. Television soon became the hearth of the modern home. Families ate dinners on trays in front of glowing screens. Politicians rose or fell by how they looked on camera, and astronauts walking on the moon in 1969 were seen by over 500 million people. Historians debate whether television created a shared culture or a passive audience, but either way, it rewired evenings forever. Fun fact, the first color TVs in the 1950s cost the equivalent of several months' wages. Owners often invited neighbors over to watch, turning television into both entertainment and social ritual. Odd fact, remote controls were nicknamed lazy bones when introduced in 1950. The fear was they would make people too sedentary. Spoiler, they were right, but nobody gave them back. From radio's crackle to TV's glow, signals across the air created a world of simultaneous experience. The coronation of a queen, a moon landing, a boxing match, a sitcom laugh track, all became communal moments. Distance no longer meant isolation, it meant tuning in at the same time. Historians still argue whether this age made us more connected or more manipulated. Propaganda spread as easily as music. Politicians learned to perform for cameras, advertisers to seduce with jingles. The same waves that carried comfort also carried control. Invention is never neutral. It hums with both promise and peril. And here you are, lying in your room, phone glowing softly, a tiny descendant of those grand machines. Your podcasts, your Netflix queue, your FaceTime calls, all of them are echoes of that first crackling S leaping across the Atlantic. The signals are still in the air, invisible but everywhere, buzzing gently around you as you drift. The glow of a television screen fades, and now you notice a quieter, sharper light, the flicker of a cursor on a monitor, the faint hum of a machine that doesn't just play sound or pictures, but thinks, calculates, and remembers. You've wandered into the realm of circuits and code, where inventions don't just carry voices or visions, but process entire worlds inside their tiny cores. It begins larger than you'd expect, massive machines filling entire rooms, their whirring fans and clacking relays echoing like mechanical heartbeats. Fun fact, ENIAC, built in 1945, is often called the first general-purpose electronic computer. It weighed 30 tons, used over 17,000 vacuum tubes, and consumed enough electricity to dim lights across Philadelphia. Oddly, it could only store about 20 10-digit numbers at once, yet it was hailed as a marvel of speed and logic. Odd fact, debugging computers was once quite literal. In 1947, engineers at Harvard found an actual moth stuck inside a relay, causing errors. They taped the insect into the logbook and labeled it the first actual case of bug being found. That's why your software issues today are still called bugs. Historians still argue whether Charles Babbage deserves the title of father of the computer. His analytical engine, conceived in the 1830s, was never built, but its design included concepts like memory and programmable instructions. Ada Lovelace, writing notes on his machine, even outlined what we'd now call algorithms. Some say they invented the computer in theory. Others argue invention requires a working device. Then came the transistor, a tiny switch that replaced clunky vacuum tubes. Fun fact, invented in 1947 at Bell Labs, the transistor is often considered the most important invention of the 20th century. Without it, no microchips, no laptops, no smartphones. Odd fact, one of the inventors, William Shockley, later became infamous not for science but for promoting controversial views on genetics, proof that brilliance in one area doesn't prevent folly in another. From transistors came integrated circuits, thousands, then millions of switches etched onto a fingernail-sized chip. Fun fact, Gordon Moore, co-founder of Intel, predicted in 1965 that the number of transistors on a chip would double roughly every 2 years. His Moore's Law held true for decades, fueling the exponential growth of computing power. Odd fact, today's microchips have more transistors than there are stars in the Milky Way, all flipping on and off silently while you scroll TikTok or write emails. Historians still argue about who really pioneered the personal computer revolution. Was it Steve Wozniak with the Apple Wine in 1976, hand-soldered in a garage, or IBM, whose 1981 PC standardized the industry? Or perhaps Xerox PARC, where many core ideas like the graphical user interface and the mouse were invented but poorly commercialized? Invention, once again, is not a single spark, but a fire spreading between minds. Fun fact, the first computer mouse, invented in 1964 by Douglas Engelbart, was made of wood. It had 2 perpendicular wheels underneath to track movement, primitive but revolutionary. Odd fact, Engelbart hated the term mouse. He thought it sounded silly, yet the name stuck and scurried across the globe. Then came software, the invisible invention. Code, lines of logic written by humans, gave machines personality and purpose. Fun fact, Grace Hopper developed the first compiler, a tool that let people write instructions in words instead of raw machine code. Without her, programming might still be a cryptic jungle of numbers and switches. Odd fact, Hopper also popularized the term computer bug, decades after that poor moth, and she liked handing out foot-long lengths of wire as nanoseconds to explain how far electricity travels in that time. Historians debate whether artificial intelligence is a true invention or simply the inevitable extension of code. Alan Turing, in the 1950s, asked whether machines could think, and his Turing test still sparks arguments. Some say modern AI systems pass, others say imitation isn't intelligence. Either way, the conversation began the moment circuits became fast enough to simulate thought. Meanwhile, computers shrank, from refrigerator-sized cabinets to desktops, from desktops to laptops, and then into pockets. Fun fact, the first smartphone, IBM's Simon in 1992, had a touchscreen, calendar, and even email. It sold poorly, but it was decades ahead of its time. Odd fact, Nokia once released a phone with a built-in Geiger counter designed for detecting radiation. Not exactly a bestseller, but inventive nonetheless. Today, you carry more computing power in your pocket than NASA had when it landed astronauts on the moon. You idly check memes, yet the same silicon brain could guide rockets, simulate weather, or map genomes. It's humbling, like carrying a genie in your jeans, but mostly asking it for pizza delivery and cat videos. And here, lying in the dark, you realize these circuits and codes hum around you now. Every notification buzz, every soft glow of a charging cable, every invisible cloud syncing your data, all of it is the quiet machinery of the digital age. It is not loud like trains or dazzling like light bulbs. It is soft, subtle, relentless, reshaping the world line by line, byte by byte. The inventions of circuits and code are not just tools, they are mirrors, reflecting humanity's desire to offload memory, speed up thought, and maybe, just maybe, create something that thinks alongside us. Whether that is salvation or hubris remains an open debate. For now, it is simply here, humming as you drift into the next dream. The hum of circuits fades, and now you drift outward, far outward, beyond the walls of rooms and offices, beyond the air itself, into a cold silence where invention stretches its gaze to the stars. Here begins the story of eyes beyond Earth, the telescopes, rockets, and satellites that carried human curiosity past the blue dome of sky and into the infinite. It starts humbly with glass. In 1609, Galileo turned a simple telescope toward the heavens and saw moons circling Jupiter, mountains on the moon, and countless stars invisible to the naked eye. Fun fact, his telescope magnified only about 20 times less powerful than a cheap pair of modern binoculars, yet it overturned centuries of belief, proving Earth was not the center of the universe. Odd fact, when Galileo published his discoveries, some critics refused to even look through his telescope, convinced the instrument was trickery. It's a reminder that sometimes invention shows more than people are ready to see. Historians still argue whether Galileo truly invented the telescope or merely improved on Dutch spyglasses. Either way, his application of it to the sky transformed a tool of merchants and sailors into one of science's most powerful inventions. The telescope grew larger, clearer, sharper. Fun fact, the Hubble Space Telescope, launched in 1990, orbits Earth and avoids atmospheric distortion, capturing images so precise they've reshaped cosmology. Odd fact, when first launched, Hubble's mirror was ground incorrectly, blurring its images. NASA had to send astronauts on a space repair mission in 1993 to fix it, essentially giving the telescope a giant pair of glasses. And then came rockets, carrying more than glass, they carried people. The first rockets were weapons, Chinese fire arrows in the 13th century, later artillery in European wars. But in the 20th century, scientists dreamed bigger. Fun fact, the V-2 rocket, designed by Wernher von Braun during World War II, became the basis for post-war space programs in both the US and Soviet Union. It was the dark seed of space travel. Odd fact, von Braun once sketched plans for a Mars mission in the 1950s that included a massive fleet of spacecraft and crews in the hundreds. Reality was humbler, but his imagination was boundless. Historians debate who truly won the space race. The Soviet Union launched Sputnik in 1957, the first artificial satellite, a beeping sphere that shocked the world. Then they sent Yuri Gagarin into orbit in 1961, the first human to circle Earth. But the US reached the moon in 1969, Neil Armstrong stepping onto its dust with the words everyone remembers. Was victory the first step into orbit or the first step onto another world? The argument remains. Fun fact, the Apollo guidance computer, which navigated astronauts to the moon, had less processing power than a modern digital watch, yet it was reliable enough to guide a 250,000-mile journey through the void. Odd fact, Buzz Aldrin, the second man on the moon, accidentally broke the ignition switch needed to launch the lunar module back off the surface. He fixed it with a felt-tip pen, a reminder that sometimes the most advanced missions still depend on office supplies. Satellites quickly filled the skies, weather forecasting, GPS, television broadcasts, even your phone's map app all rely on orbiting machines. Fun fact, the first GPS satellite, launched in 1978, was part of a military navigation system. Today, there are over 30 active satellites, triangulating your location within a few meters while you casually look for the nearest coffee shop. Odd fact, space junk is now a serious problem. Old satellites, rocket parts, and fragments circle Earth at thousands of miles per hour. Even a paint chip in orbit can hit with the force of a bullet. Historians may one day mark the space age not only by the moon landing, but by the ring of debris we've left behind. And still, telescopes reach further. Fun fact, the James Webb Space Telescope, launched in 2021, can see light from galaxies formed over 13 billion years ago, almost touching the edge of time itself. Odd fact, its golden mirrors are so sensitive they could detect the heat of a bumblebee on the moon. Historians debate whether space exploration is humanity's greatest achievement or a colossal vanity project. Billions spent to touch rocks, to capture photos, while problems persist on Earth. Others argue the opposite, that every advance in space, satellites, solar panels, materials science, has cascaded back into daily life. And beyond that, space travel is a reminder that humanity's horizon is never fixed. You lie here now, under your ceiling, but beyond it stretches an unthinkable gulf, mapped by inventions of glass and fire, code and courage. Somewhere above, a satellite is passing, unseen but watching, perhaps relaying someone's message or guiding someone's car. In the quiet of night, you are both tiny and vast, a single dreamer beneath a sky filled with human-made stars. The stars and satellites fade into the distance, and you feel yourself pulled back down to Earth. But the Earth is no longer the same. A quiet vibration in your pocket, a glowing rectangle on your nightstand, a message from across the world appearing instantly. These are the inventions that knit the modern planet into one restless, buzzing web. Welcome to the realm of invisible networks, the internet, smartphones, and social media. It started with cables. Fun fact, the first transatlantic telegraph cable was laid in 1858, connecting North America to Europe. A message that once took weeks by ship now traveled in minutes. Odd fact, the cable broke after only a month, but the idea proved unstoppable. By the late 19th century, the globe was wired, and empires managed colonies with the speed of electric pulses. But the internet proper came much later. In 1969, ARPANET, funded by the US Department of Defense, linked just 4 computers. Fun fact, the first message was supposed to be Lagoon. The system crashed after just 2 letters, LO. Historians sometimes joke that the internet began with LO, as if it were greeting the world. Odd fact, one of the early uses of ARPANET was for computer scientists to plan pizza parties. Even at the dawn of global connectivity, humans used new tech for snacks. By the 1990s, the World Wide Web turned obscure data-sharing systems into something anyone with a modem could access. Tim Berners-Lee's invention of hyperlinks and browsers made the web navigable. Historians still argue whether the web was an invention or an adaptation, After all, the internet already existed, but in practice, it was the difference between raw electricity and a glowing lamp. Suddenly, the whole world could see. Fun fact, the first website ever created is still online, a plain page describing the World Wide Web itself. Odd fact, early websites often featured under construction signs with cartoon shovels as if the internet were a literal roadwork project. Then came the smartphone, shrinking the network into your palm. The iPhone in 2007 wasn't the first, but it was the spark that made billions shift. Suddenly, the internet was no longer a place you visited at a desk, it was always with you. Fun fact, by 2023, over 6.5 billion people worldwide owned smartphones, more than had access to clean toilets. Odd fact, the average person checks their phone over 90 times a day, often without even ref. The stars and satellites fade into the distance, and you feel yourself pulled back down to Earth, but the Earth is no longer the same. A quiet vibration in your pocket, a glowing rectangle on your nightstand, a message from across the world appearing instantly. These are the inventions that knit the modern planet into one restless, buzzing web. Welcome to the realm of invisible networks, the internet, smartphones, and social media. It started with cables. Fun fact, the first transatlantic telegraph cable was laid in 1858, connecting North America to Europe. A message that once took weeks by ship now traveled in minutes. Odd fact, the cable broke after only a month, but the idea proved unstoppable. By the late 19th century, the globe was wired, and empires managed colonies with the speed of electric pulses. But the internet proper came much later. In 1969, ARPANET, funded by the US Department of Defense, linked just 4 computers. Fun fact, the first message was supposed to be Lagoon. The system crashed after just 2 letters, LO. Historians sometimes joke that the internet began with LO, as if it were greeting the world. Odd fact, one of the early uses of ARPANET was for computer scientists to plan pizza parties. Even at the dawn of global connectivity, humans used new tech for snacks. By the 1990s, the World Wide Web turned obscure data sharing systems into something anyone with a modem could access. Tim Berners-Lee's invention of hyperlinks and browsers made the web navigable. Historians still argue whether the web was an invention or an adaptation. After all, the internet already existed, but in practice, it was the difference between raw electricity and a glowing lamp. Suddenly, the whole world could see. Fun fact, the first website ever created is still online, a plain page describing the World Wide Web itself. Odd fact, early websites often featured under construction signs with cartoon shovels, as if the internet were a literal roadwork project. Then came the smartphone, shrinking the network into your palm. The iPhone in 2007 wasn't the first, but it was the spark that made billions shift. Suddenly, the internet was no longer a place you visited at a desk, it was always with you. Fun fact, by 2023, over 6.5 billion people worldwide owned smartphones, more than had access to clean toilets. Odd fact, the average person checks their phone over 90 times a day, often without even realizing it. Historians debate whether smartphones liberated us or enslaved us. They carry libraries, cameras, compasses, and maps, yet also tether us to endless notifications. Invention always promises freedom, but often delivers new chains. And then social media. Platforms that began as college networks or photo-sharing apps became global stages. Fun fact, Facebook was originally restricted to Harvard students in 2004, growing so fast it became the largest country in the world by population. Odd fact, Twitter's 140-character limit was based on old text message restrictions. That small design choice helped shape global political discourse. Historians argue whether social media is an invention of connection or chaos. It toppled dictators and spread misinformation, built communities and fueled loneliness. Its dual nature is perhaps the clearest reminder that invention is never just about tools, it's about how we wield them. Invisible networks now control everything from your bank account to your fridge. Satellites guide delivery trucks, algorithms suggest music, artificial intelligence finishes your sentences. Fun fact, more than 90% of the world's data has been created in just the last 2 years. Odd fact, much of that data is cat videos, memes, and selfies, proving that humanity's grand digital tapestry is woven with equal parts genius and silliness. You lie here now, the glow of your phone faint against the dark, knowing you are cradled by invisible threads stretching across continents. Messages leap oceans in milliseconds, friendships stretch across time zones, knowledge hums in your palm. The networks are unseen but everywhere, like a second atmosphere wrapping the globe. And yet historians will forever debate whether this invention made us wiser or just louder, whether it drew us closer or left us each scrolling alone, whether the web is humanity's greatest library or its most elaborate mirror. Perhaps it is both. Perhaps, like every invention before, it is simply a reflection of who we are. The hum of those invisible networks fades now, softer, softer still. The story of invention has carried you from fire to fiber optics, from stone tools to satellites. You've drifted through sparks, engines, vaccines, signals, circuits, rockets, and now the restless web that binds it all. And as the story slows, you feel the gentle truth. Every invention is a dream made tangible, a fragile hope hammered into steel or etched into silicone. Each is humanity reaching a little further, lighting a candle against the night. And now, as the last of these stories settles around you like mist, the inventions recede into a soft background hum. They are not roaring machines or glowing screens anymore. They are simply the quiet threads holding up your world. The bed you lie in, the light you turned off, the fan spinning gently in the dark, all are inventions too, their origins hidden but their comfort undeniable. The story of humanity is not just the story of individuals, but of tools, each one stretching survival, reshaping possibility. Fire in a cave, wheels on a road, code in a circuit, satellites in orbit, all steps in a single stumbling brilliant march forward. You've wandered through 100 facts, yes, but also through 100 reflections on how fragile curiosity becomes enduring change. As your eyes grow heavier, you realize the inventions are not only out there, in history books and laboratories, they are here, woven into the fabric of your ordinary night. The mattress, the clock, the very words you're hearing now carried across invisible lines, each is a fragment of human imagination made solid. And in this moment, invention feels less like history and more like lullaby. Each machine, each discovery, is a soft hand guiding you, reminding you that humanity, for all its chaos, has always dreamed of making life longer, warmer, easier. It is not perfect, it is not finished, but it is ongoing, and you are part of it. So let the story fade now. Let the hum of fans and circuits dissolve into the rhythm of your breathing. Let invention rest, just for a while, as you drift into the oldest invention of all, the dream.